What would the workplace feel like if dignity was not only an expectation, but a requirement? For nearly a decade, the National Workplace Bullying Coalition has been advocating for a Dignity at Work Act. We'll talk with one of the leaders of this effort up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Safety at work is more than freedom from physical injury. To be safe, you have to feel safe. Join us each week as we discuss psychologically healthy and safe work in the USA.
Well, welcome to this week's episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, and advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. Workplace bullying is unwanted, unwelcome abuse of any source of power that has the effect of or intent to intimidate, control, or otherwise strip a target of their right to esteem, growth, dignity, voice, and other human rights in the workplace. Abusive conduct means the conduct of an employer or an employee in the workplace that has a reasonable person feeling as if it's hostile. Abusive conduct includes, but is not limited to, verbal or physical conduct that a reasonable person would find threatening, intimidating, or humiliating. The gratuitous sabotage or undermining of an employee's work performance. Attempts to exploit an employee's known psychological or physical vulnerability, or repeated infliction of verbal abuse, such as derogatory remarks, insults, epithets. Both these definitions would qualify as psychosocial hazards. And these are issues that have been part of the driving focus behind the National Workplace Bullying Coalition. Coalition was formed in 2014 by Beverly Peterson, a filmmaker and professor at Montclair State University. Building off a loose collection of mainly New Jersey and Pennsylvania-based academics, the coalition launched this national campaign in April 2014 at Rutgers School of Law in New Jersey. I'm pleased today to have the president of the coalition for this episode and for our conversation about workplace bullying. And I'm looking forward to digging into the coalition's activities and finding out more and sharing more with all of you what the coalition is all about. So we're just going to go there. And I tend to start these conversations off with a question. And the question for today's guest is, who is Jerry Carbo?
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me here, Dr. Daniels. It's a great honor. I think the starting point for describing me is I'm a person who spent the past 25 years studying the world of work. I'm a professor at Shippensburg University. I teach in the business school, but my focus is really on workers' rights and employee rights. I was a person who went to law school during some of the times of the worst forms of workplace harassment that we could see, and actually saw those in some of the biggest law firms in the country. And I think that really shaped the rest of my career, seeing that and being, really dejected by people who I'd looked up to that point in time, doing such horrible things in the workplace and causing such great harm for workers. And the more I've studied it in these past 25 years, the more I realize the problem is even worse than what I thought. And it's rampant, it's pervasive, the outcomes are so damaging. And so I've spent my career studying that. And for the past decade, I've been a member of the National Workplace Bullying Coalition and been the president of the National Workplace Bullying Coalition since late in 2018. So just about 4 years at this point. My hope is still that before the end of my career that we can address these issues in an effective way, that we can, at the very least, catch up to what some other industrialized countries are doing to, prevent, detect, remedy, and eliminate bullying and harassment in the workplace.
Sure, sure. So when you hear the term psychological health and safety,
Yeah.
what does that conjure up for you? What do you think about when you hear that?
Yeah. So for me, everything that I do comes from a human rights perspective. So the first thing that it brings up to me is, this is a basic fundamental human right. It's actually a building block of all human rights, this right to dignity that every human being has, and it's an inviolable right. It's something that can't be lost. And people have a right to that. When we walk through the doors of our employer, we shouldn't have to give that right up. But for millions of workers every single day in the United States, and then millions more across the globe, they do give that up. And they suffer this harm, and they're not treated with that dignity, and they're not protected, given that psychological safety that is just a fundamental need. It's at the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we seem to ignore it.
Yeah, so interesting point that you just mentioned about Maslow's hierarchy, because you see so many employers having this conversation about employee engagement and how can we get them excited about coming to work, and they skip over the first step in the hierarchy, the safety piece, and then what some will do is they suggest, well, they didn't get a back injury today. Nobody got burned, none of that type of thing. So to talk a little bit more about how you see the dignity and how people are treated as actually kind of a safety related thing.
Yeah, I just, you made me think of all of my time in industry, which was actually before my time of jumping into to studying this, as well as a little bit after. But, coming into a manufacturing plant and seeing the sign up on the wall, 0 days without a workplace injury, and working as at that point in time, the time I'm thinking about as an employer relations manager, and thinking back to that and thinking, oh, that's just not accurate. It's 0 days since there's been a physical injury in this workplace, but I know right now that we have abusive supervisors who I'm trying to work on, who I'm trying to get them to understand that this is not how you treat people, and you don't treat people differently in work just because you're treating them. Just because they're at work, you would treat them the same anywhere in your life, I would hope, and treat them with dignity and respect. And it's a safety issue because of the harm that's done. The harm of these psychological injuries is oftentimes much worse than a physical injury. We recover from physical injuries, but years later we still see the effects oftentimes of these psychological injuries, and so many you never recover from. And it's interesting, the National Workplace Bullying Coalition a few years ago put a book together, our then Vice President Sue Young and our President Catherine Mattice, about success stories of targets of workplace bullying. And there are 23 stories in there. And one of the themes that emerges pretty quickly when you read it is, while at the end of the day they viewed these as success, the targets themselves, the reality is they still suffered this enduring harm, and none of them were able to escape that harm. So this is definitely a safety issue, and it's
Right.
it needs to be addressed as such, as well as coming at it from other angles as well. The human rights angle, and even the criminal angle as well.
Right. Yeah. So again, that's kind of where I was going next. You listed amongst your long list of accomplishments this. You decided to take the LSAT and go to law school and all of that. So, why'd you want to do that? How'd that work out? How did you stumble into becoming, someone interested in the law?
Yeah. So it's a bit of a safety issue, non-employees issue. I started off as a tax accountant, and I thought for sure I was going to be a tax attorney. And my second year of law school, I met a professor, Kurt Decker, who was teaching employment law, and he has since passed away. But he just inspired me. And he told me about his experiences as an employment attorney, working within labor unions. And the class wasn't just about reading through case laws, but it was also listening about the experiences that he had working with employees and their experiences in the workplace. And it just sort of opened my eyes to thinking back through all the things I had already seen up to that point, but then wanting to dig in deeper and see, what is going on with work and with workers, and why do we see this suffering? And once I dug into that a little bit, there's just so much. There's so
Right.
much, and there's so much abuse in our history of work, as well as our current employment systems. That I felt like that is where I needed to be.
So this passion that you have around dignity at work, if you're willing to share, is this driven by, if you can think about the one or two seminal events that caused you to go that way, was it something that you experienced, or something directly, or something you observed occurring with other people? And again, often our brains don't really know the difference. Trauma is often just as bad or worse when we see it happen to other people as it is to us. So is there, an example or an experience back there that kind of got you or triggered you and got you thinking about it in this way?
Yeah, I think there are a couple. One of the things that really ended up being the reason I took the employment law course, because it's an elective in law school, was my own experience in my first professional job. To date myself a little bit, was right after the savings and loan crisis. And as an accountant, I had a job with a big six accounting firm, and they took a lot of hit in the savings and loan crisis. So for all of us who were sort of new, they just sort of took steps to brush us aside, because that was a way for them to save costs. So sort of saw that as, this was an unfair treatment. But what really drove me to the dignity came later on, and it was in my career as an attorney, when I opened up my own law office. And the majority of clients who would come in with complaints of harassment, I'd end up having to turn them away, because we couldn't show that it was based upon race or color, national origin, gender, age, status, or disability. And even those that we had the possibility of showing that, it was always this huge hurdle to see. And I remember two clients in particular. One that was really a simple unemployment case, but her workplace bully decided to contest unemployment, and then during the hearing tried to intimidate her. And she was a fairly small individual, and he was this 6'4", 300-pound guy, and he literally physically tried to intimidate her during the hearing, which of course helped our case, but at the same time was really damaging to her, and seeing how it impacted her. And I had another client not long after that who also suffered, the physical manifestations of the psychological injuries at work. And every day that I worked with her, I could see those, and from trembling hands to needing medication, and clearly having PTSD syndrome. And it just that to me said, there's got to be a better way to help people who are suffering this than our broken legal system, which is really just hanging them out to dry. And yeah, I might be able to get them unemployment that helps them for, a few weeks or the next 6 months. But, after that, they're really left with no real recourse. And so I wanted to really focus on something that I thought would make people stand up and pay attention. And dignity being the foundation of all human rights, I thought, how can you argue against dignity in the workplace? Some people do, though, surprisingly.
Wow. Yeah, I there's that the concept of adverse childhood experience and how it affects people throughout the rest of their life. And I don't know. I certainly haven't done the research myself, but I believe there's some pretty adverse adult experiences as well.
Yeah.
But particularly in the early part of folks' working career, because again, they're excited about that new job and they got a promotion or a raise, or they finally, after going to school and spending most of their life, sometimes I really want to be one of those until you get there.
Yeah.
And then you find out that the environment itself, and again, it's not that, again, you slipped and, broke your ankle or, threw your shoulder out or anything. So people can't physically see the damage, but it's there. And it carries on from group to employer into people's private life. It follows people because it's the trauma associated with being exposed to the behavior that folks are exposed to. So that's quite, actually almost noble, to go into law to try to help, and then to find out it's there as well. Isn't that interesting?
Definitely problematic. And it, reminds me of another story just real quickly. First year of law school, I remember my torts professor said, one thing law school will do is it's going to make you paranoid. And because you're going to read these cases. And his example is, one of the cases you're going to read is about a guy who got rabies from a squirrel. And, so from that point on, you'll see a squirrel that's standing there, and rather than being like, oh, look, maybe we could feed it, you're going to be wanting to go the other direction. And it definitely did that with me with employment. And when you mention those early traumas, I think about the way that we send our kids off to work at the ages of 15 and 16. And oftentimes some of the worst workplaces for bullying and harassment. And people don't realize, but a lot of the fast food companies, a lot of the, retail jobs, they have rampant levels of unlawful harassment as well as just workplace bullying and that traumatic effect. And for me personally, it sort of led to me, being really hesitant to allow my kids to go into the workplace, which is damaging as well. So you're sort of caught in between this, we want them to, get the potential skills they can get from work, but I also don't want them to be damaged in a way that can be traumatic their entire lives. So it creates a tough situation.
It does. It does. Yeah. And it sometimes is a carry on from the bullying that some kids experience, or a lot of kids experience, even in middle to high school. Because their colleagues can be vicious, the other kids can be vicious, and the systems. I mean, most of the research that's gone on in this country around this topic has been around schools and what we do there and teaching the kids and all that type of thing. But many of those bullies just grow up and get a job and take those same tendencies into the workplace as the bully and or as the target. And sometimes they switch. Yeah. But it's the same kind of behavior. And so interesting, we're having this, discussion now about education. So now you're in higher education as well.
Yes.
Which is another environment. The two occupations that have some of the highest exposure to particular workplace violence is healthcare and education. Yeah. So chat a little bit about how you ended up in higher ed.
Yeah. So I think, again, this was part of the path of there's got to be a better way. Right. And so the legal system is so limited, and I still do practice law, but, my hope is that through higher education, through research, through training future managers, that's where I can make the bigger difference, really convince people to treat people with dignity, and on the other side of that, also convince people to stand up for their rights in the workplace. It's one of the things that I always find it interesting that we don't teach high school kids about what their rights are at work and what they should expect in the workplace. And then we don't do it in college either, right? We'll prepare them to say, as a manager, you should do X, Y, and Z, but we never talk about, well, as a worker, here's what you should do. So I always try to take the classes I teach, even within the business school, and sort of flip them that way, so that students understand it doesn't matter what you're doing, you're a worker too. And even if you're, manager at whatever level, you're still a worker, and you should stand up for those rights that you have, and be aware of where you don't have legal rights, but you should, and think about how can you play a role in doing that. So that's really why I went into higher education, was to say, let's find a better route where I can reach more people. And that's also why I work with the NWBC and have spent, 10 years dedicated to this organization, is so that I can reach more people, to help them to understand about workplace bullying, understand that we don't have legal rights in the United States, but that we should. And then to also, give them routes that they can at least try to assert some legal rights, to know, this is how you try to make the case that it is about a protected status, and at least present it to the EEOC, human rights commissions and states, those types of things.
Sure. So how does your work experience, your pursuit of more information through the legal profession and then higher ed, how does that all lead you to ending up with the coalition?
Well, it was really, I guess, a combination of my legal work and my academic work, because one of the first articles I published, I was specifically asked to write about the healthy workplace bill and how it could be improved. And that was actually a big part of my dissertation, was drafting a model bill. And so that piece was just sort of natural out of that. And at that point in time, New Jersey was actually proposing the healthy workplace bill. So Bev Peterson, who had already formed the NWBC, although, wasn't an official organization at that point, she had really formed it, I would say, around 2012, although officially we became an organization in 2014. She reached out to me and asked me about the article. And, I thought, this was my first academic publication. Like, this is sort of odd for someone to call me and be interested. I'm like, yeah, I'll talk about it. This is sort of neat. And then she let me know about the bill that was being proposed, and how the senator who was proposing it was interested in hearing, some feedback of what could be improved and what pieces were strong, and as well as, making the business case. And so that's how I got started with NWBC, and I helped to, draft some amendments, as well as to, help present the business case for why this should be a no-brainer for organizations to support. And from there, we just, continued to expand, and we had that conference in 2014, and it was so well attended, and it sort of helped us all realize that we can really reach a lot of people if we continue this work.
Absolutely. Yeah. So taking what you all have done in the coalition over the past few years, the most obvious product is the Dignity at Work Act. That seems to be the flag that gets flown when we talk about the coalition. So tell us a little bit about the act, and what it's about and how it's structured and that type of thing.
Yeah, so the Dignity at Work Act initially came out of, as I said, my dissertation research. It was, I talk about a number of solutions in both my dissertation as well as a book I published later on. And there really have to be there has to be at least what one of my committee members, Lance Compa, calls a three-legged stool to assure any type of employee rights. And that is, we need strong laws with strong enforcement. We need a strong labor movement that focuses on the day-to-day rights. And we also need employers who do the right thing, because we can't police all employers, even if we have strong laws. So the focus of that law for me, developing it, was to make sure it's strong, to make sure that it has enforcement. And so that meant making sure that it covers all forms of workplace bullying. And so I looked at the U.S. laws on workplace harassment, the gaps there, the U.S. laws on intentional infliction of emotional distress, the gaps there, looked at international laws, both the successes and failures, and then spoke with targets and said, what are your experiences? And is this capturing that? And so I came up with that in my dissertation. But then what happened over the years is, with the coalition for about 3 years, we talked to other targets, other experts, and we continued to tweak the Dignity at Work Act. And I think it continues to be tweaked. And, I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect law. I think that we continue to learn. And as we continue to learn, we should continue to adjust. And one of the things I've tried to do is I've tried to have as many voices involved in drafting the Dignity at Work Act for wherever it's proposed, whether that be localities, states, or hopefully eventually a federal law, and to make sure that it is protecting all workers, and then granting access, because for so many people there's not access to the legal system. So we want to make sure that there's a way for workers to get real access and access to a system that has enforcement powers, because with all due respect to our EEOC system, there's really very little enforcement that comes out of the EEOC. There's investigation, but then it's really just conciliation or mediation, and then giving a right to sue letter, which puts the plaintiff right back in that situation of not having access to a very expensive, complex legal system.
Wow. And I so the act has been drafted for a decade or so. Where has it had the most success? Because I don't think it's necessarily been adopted anywhere quite yet.
Has not.
Yeah.
So, a couple of years ago in Rhode Island, it passed the Senate unanimously.
Okay.
The House never took it up, or at least never voted on it. They did have it in committee. Massachusetts, we went through a joint committee, and there it was, we had testimony, a full day of testimony. And it was sort of unfortunate that many of the committee members didn't stick around for the full day of testimony. In fact, only the chair ended up staying the entire time. So, it's had some traction at the state level. We've had sponsors in Michigan. We've had sponsors in Florida. But as of right now, I don't know of any state that it's actually on the agenda or in a committee. So we're sort of, again, I think starting from scratch and getting the bill forward and seeing where it goes from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting challenge that we have in the country, that the legal system is slow to begin with in terms of implementing new regulation around anything, and it's particularly slow when people can't put their hands on whatever the issue is. I mean, it's not something that, and there hasn't been this huge catastrophic, there hasn't been a 9/11, or there hasn't been a hurricane, or there hasn't been a Bhopal, India. There hasn't been that, but there's been this slow, almost consistent impact on people that doesn't necessarily get measured. You made me think when you chatted earlier, I can make the argument that not only do young and old people going into their first job or their early employment, not only do they not know what their rights are, they have been almost conditioned to be exploited.
Yeah.
It's, because there's, particularly parts in the country, and this is not a for or against labor unions. That's not the point. But the reason that labor unions exist is often because of how people are treated. That's why they get started. The reason that there are regulations around, discrimination, harassment, it's how people are treated. It's back to the same thing. And it's how they feel about it. So in my research, my definition of a psychosocial hazard is a psychosocial factor that's perceived or experienced by the person exposed as a threat.
Yes. Exactly.
And we often look for these cookie cutter approaches that says, let's do this thing that's going to be the same for everybody. Well, that presupposes that we actually are the same. Yes. And I get it. We're all humans. We all breathe and our blood's red and all that kind of stuff. But my perception of the same environment that you might find perfectly comfortable, it just might be different. And it doesn't mean that because the company says it's not, dangerous and it's not a hazard, that I might perceive it as one. And that's really the conversation. And like 30 other countries have already figured out
Yes.
what they do is they address it as a safety issue.
Yeah.
It's a safety thing. So, and mandates that employers in many countries around the world, it mandates that you do something about it. It doesn't suggest you're going to eliminate the hazard all the time.
Right.
It just says you should do something about it to mitigate the impact on the human being before they get stressed out and before they get burned out and before they commit suicide or workplace violence or something like that. It's before, and it's interesting to hear your focus on trying to train and educate leaders before they become a bully.
Yes. Yes.
Because that seems to be missing.
It does. And, it was in 2015 and 2016, I got to serve on the EEOC Select Task Force for the Study of Workplace Harassment. And, one of the things that the commissioners who brought that group together, Commissioner Lipnick and Feldblum, made clear is that we need to stop this before it even rises to the legal level of unlawful harassment. And, and that was focused, of course, on harassment based upon protected statuses. But we need to do the same thing with bullying. I mean, the prevention is the key. That's what I really want. I mean, nobody wants to be harmed. And I remember, again, back to law school, thinking of these discussions about, tort reform and medical malpractice reform and having to explain, to people, nobody wants to have a catastrophic medical injury. They don't want to sue. It's that, and it never brings them to where they would be if the injury didn't happen. And it's the same thing here. Nobody wants to be bullied and then get some court award out of it, or some type of payment or compensation. They want to not be bullied, and they want to not be harassed, and we need to stop it on the front end. And it's one of the frustrating things about, because of that, employers should be working with employee groups. They should be working with labor unions. They should be working with advocates like us, and to say, let's eliminate this, let's prevent this. And if you prevent it, you never even have to worry about the legal liability. And you get all those other things: workplace satisfaction, workplace commitment, reduced absenteeism, reduced turnover, citizenship behaviors. And in some cases, it looks like you might even get more production, people were producing more widgets per hour as well. Right. You can worry about those higher level needs and those higher level rewards in the workplace.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Sure. So have you, as we are, again, I'm not sure where we are with this pandemic some days, because just when I think things are getting good, then you hear of something popping up somewhere. So do you believe that the experience that we've all had over the last few years relative to a global pandemic has raised awareness of this issue or put us in a place where something might happen, or do you see a connection at all?
I do in a number of ways. I think, my initial thought was, in probably as early as March of 2020, was that this is pretty clear that this is going to be what epidemiologists term a 100-year pandemic, right? And so it's something that we only have to deal with once every 100 years. And I thought this is a chance for people to come together. This is a chance for employers to do the right thing. By May or June of that same year, I'm realizing, nope, that's not going to happen. In fact, employers are doing the wrong thing. They are, denying accommodations. They are, minimizing the risk. When the FFCRA came out, I heard all kinds of complaints about workers being denied the leave that they're entitled to under the FFCRA. Then the abuses really started to show up. The bullying and the work of these essential workers, and employers clamoring for more and more people to be defined as essential workers, not because we value them as workers, but because we want to force them into work during this pandemic. And the awareness, though, that came out of it, I think we see that with the Starbucks union. We see that with Chris Smalls. I mean, what he did as a supervisor walking out of Amazon because they were allowing the people he was supervising to be exposed to COVID and knowingly seeing them get sick and do nothing about it. And then that led to him, leading the union movement at Amazon. And I think we also saw a lot of workers who just said, wait, our lives are more important than our work. And it's not just living, it's not just breathing, but living is about living a life worthy of being a human being. And so now we have these expectations that this is what should happen in the workplace. And I definitely, I get to see the different generations as a professor. I definitely see Gen Zs that realize this, and they have this strong belief in not just these are our human rights in the workplace, but being willing to do whatever it takes to assure those. And not to discount millennials, because I think they were a great generation too. But I think Gen Zs have taken that next step of saying, yeah, you realized it as millennials too, but sometimes you didn't take the steps, and Gen Zs will take whatever step it is.
Right.
They'll
Right.
walk out,
Right.
on a moment's notice.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah. You gotta love it. You gotta love how we have now a generation where there's some hope that they see their own value, they see their own worth, and they're willing to do what it takes to not be, mistreated, exploited. And actually, that's a word that keeps floating around in my head. I honestly believe that bullying is a form of exploitation.
yes.
It is a way to keep people exposed to not only, mental and emotional, but physical environments that they really shouldn't be in. And again,
Yes.
there was a time in this country, particularly for people who, look like me, where it was legal to chain me up and, physically restrain me. And then when that passed, what the system has now done is, well, we can't hold you physically, but we'll hold you emotionally, psychologically. Yes. We'll tell you, oh yeah, don't organize. We'll tell you, don't complain. Go along with it, because if you don't, you might lose your job. And again, Gen Z's coming around saying, well, I can find another one.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And if I can't, I won't, even for a while.
That's right.
You're exactly right. I mean, our entire employment relationship has always been built on control. And it's not surprising, because we come from this country that, of slavery that built so much of our economy. And we seem to have never looked back and said, how do we repair all the damage that we've done as a result of this? And instead we went forward, and Wood's treatise, written in 1860 or maybe 1880s, maybe a little bit later, but that was entitled Master and Servant. To me, when I see that title, my first thought is, wow, there's something wrong with somebody who would title a book or a legal treatise that. It was readily adopted, across the United States, and it created this system of employment at will. And from there, it's just been different types of concerted control. And bullying is about control, and it's a form of control, and it's perpetrated not unknowingly, but it's perpetrated to control targets as well as bystanders.
Right.
You can pick one target and you control them, but you strike fear in all those around that the same thing might happen to them.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. So spending all these years with the coalition, higher ed, and the law, kind of battling this whole discussion about bullying, I'd imagine you've probably come across some places, some environments, or some situations that have figured it out, and seem to be doing well. So what are some examples of some, not particularly names unless you want to use them, but have you seen some places with law or not have just figured out that, we can do this different and better, and they actually have?
Yeah. So unfortunately, not a whole lot of examples.
Okay.
When I came into academia 20 years ago, higher ed was known for being that place where we look to see their positive employment practices, and that has sort of gone away over the past 20 years. But I do think we have some employers, and you see some green shoots. I think while his main focus at Interface Carpet was environmental sustainability, Ray Anderson understood that environmental sustainability was about benefiting human beings, including his workers. And so Interface Carpet has been that green shoot. Costco, in a textbook I wrote with some colleagues, we actually have 2 cases on Costco being that positive employer. And it starts again with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It starts with the physiological. The CEO of Costco takes a much lower salary than other CEOs because he wants to make sure that he's paying his workers well first. And so he starts there, and then they get to the safety needs and the esteem and everything else. So they're a company. One of my colleagues always talks about Patagonia, and I think they are also a pretty good company. And I think the other piece of this is if we could get back to, and this would also help with environmental sustainability, but more local economies, because it's a lot harder to strip someone of their dignity when you see them as a person every day. And so if we have these successful small businesses that see their people that work for them, not just at work, but within their communities, they're more likely to treat them with dignity. And then I think the other big area that we see this is what Richard Wolff calls worker self-directed enterprises. And we got a major one in Spain with the Mondragon, but we also see other worker-owned enterprises that have sprung up even here in the United States, where they tend to treat, as a collective of workers, you just tend to treat people better because you're one of the people. And so, I would love to see us get back to local economies as well as worker-owned enterprises, and to emulate Costco's. If you ever have the choice, between a Costco or some of their competitors that I won't name, keep in mind the positive things that Costco does for their workers and in their community. So.
That's an interesting point you bring up, is how we as advocates, as consumers, as other partners in the economy, we have a role to play as well. So I've made it my business, particularly since I finished my research, that when I go into a company, an organization, or when I get service from people, I'll stop. So I was on the phone with, I forget who it was recently. Matter of fact, it was a financial services company, and we were doing a financial transaction. And toward the end, I asked the woman on the line, and says, "Well, how long have you been with the company?" She says, whatever the period of time was. "So how do they treat you?" And I find when I ask people that, so I ask that when I go out for breakfast, or go out and get my tires changed. I tend to ask, particularly if it's not in my community, I wouldn't know anyway. I want to know how folks are being treated, because, and I tell them, the first inclination I get that you're not being treated well is probably the last time I'll come back and shop here or do business here until they do.
Yes.
And again, I realize that my whatever amount of money I'm spending won't put them out of business. But just think, if everyone did that, if everyone that you did business with, you inquired about how that other person is being treated, how do they feel about that employment relationship, and used our power, because there are some folks I rarely go to. And again, I won't mention their names either, but folks who know me know there's some places I don't go because I don't like how they treat people. And there's some big ones. I just don't go there. I don't. because they don't treat people in a way that I would want to be treated. So, and frankly, I also think they give the good housekeeping seal of approval. We ought to be able to go like, don't go shop over there because they mistreat people.
Yes.
It's not,
Yes.
it's not just
Exactly.
the prices are high, or
Yeah.
not. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a great question to ask, any place you go. Ask the person who's working there. And I definitely going to start doing that. I do sometimes try to dig, but it's not a normal question that I ask. And I think that's a great point.
It,
And we all should do that.
we all should do, because it starts to create this environment that says, I'm concerned, because again, they're not going to tell me that they
No.
didn't get training on hazard communication of bloodborne pathogens. They won't tell me that because they didn't get the training anyway. What they will say. So I was on a flight with a flight attendant and was asking that same question. She says, well, it's gotten better, and this was, as the mask mandates and stuff were dropping. But she said that was very difficult for us emotionally, because regardless how we feel, it was what the rules were, and the people they'd yell at us and and just be irate. And it's not that any of this particular flight attendant, she didn't get hit or anything. She said the emotional abuse, it makes it, you start to get a stomach ache thinking about going to work.
Yes.
And again, we should not support that. We just shouldn't support that. We just really should. I don't believe we should.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with that. And and when we see companies doing the right thing, then it makes sense to support them and to try to continue that. And again, we do need, no matter what we do, we'll always need employers who will do the right things, because you just, strongest law possible. Even at the height of the labor movement in the United States, in addition to that, 35% union density, that leaves a lot of employers that just can't be policed. So we need those employers who do the right thing. And I think I don't even know the name of his company, but you've probably seen him, Dan Price, who, was the CEO, decided to make the pay for all of his workers the same and to have his pay the same as well. And I think he said it at the time at $75,000 a year, from the worker who came in the door to the ones who've been there. And he continues to, I know he's on some of the social media quite a bit, continues to post about the success of his company. And we should reward, the companies that do treat people with dignity. And it's actually one of our 2023, it's a part of our agenda, is to certify organizations as dignity certified. And that's going to include school districts, universities, as well as employers.
So yeah, share more about that, because I did want to shift a little bit to kind of what you see coming in the future for the coalition. So share a little bit more about that certification you're considering.
Yeah, so our current vice president, Kamei McClure, started us down this road of certifying organizations, businesses. And so we developed a platform that is a survey that a leader of an organization would take. So if it's at a plant level, maybe the plant manager; if it's at the organizational level, the CEO. And that gets initial certification. And then after they complete that survey, we dig in, and they agree that for the next year that we'll sort of investigate, see if there are gaps, see if the workers feel the same way as what the employer does in terms of this survey. And if there is a misalignment between what workers see and what the CEO or plant manager sees, we then have a period of time where they can correct that. And they can come to the coalition to help them correct it. We have all kinds of experts who are part of our organization, or they can go elsewhere as long as it gets corrected, and they'll maintain that dignity certification. And then what we were able to do is we were able to find experts within our coalition in different areas. So we have a team that works primarily with labor unions, and so they are working on a dignity certification instrument for labor unions. And then we have a group that work in K-12, and they're two former teachers who've taken the lead there, and they have developed the dignity certification, and theirs is actually ready to roll out. So I'm hoping even by January they'll do our first dignity certification of a K-12 school.
Sure, outstanding, absolutely outstanding, because there is value to, as opposed to trying to shine the light on the things that we don't through sticks, is to encourage the behavior we actually want to see through carrots.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
some advantage. Now, it would be better. Again, I certainly believe it would be better to have people do it because there's some internal ethical, something in them that says it's the right thing. But I say this around safety, that people tend to focus on safety for one of three reasons. They have this ethical and moral compass that says it's the right thing to do, or they have looked at the financials and figured out it's going to save them a buck,
Yep.
or they have to.
Yes.
And in my view, either one of them works as long as it
Yes.
happens, to be quite
Exactly.
honest. As long as
Exactly.
it happens. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is, you're right. The inherent motivation is what we hope for. And we're hoping that our first couple of organizations, that is what we will find. And then we'll hopefully explore. And as we see other organizations, maybe by asking the question that you just suggested of, a worker, how do they treat you here? That might lead to our next, dignity certified company. And if they're doing it because they believe in it, it's going to last. If they're doing it to avoid punishment, we know that it can be fleeting. So even once we do grant the certification, we do plan to follow up to make sure that it's not just a rubber stamp, and that organizations are following through. So
Absolutely. Well, there is certainly a connection between the work that the coalition is doing and the work I'm so passionate about. As part of research, I created an instrument called a psychosocial hazard inventory. And it is focused on the organization and some of the psychosocial hazards that exist that they may not even know are there. So, I found it depends on the organization. It really does. But generally, there's going to be a certain, there are 88 hazards on the list. But there tend to be 5 or 6 or 10 that really are occurring. The rest, don't worry about it. And that's the way safety works. It's often about identifying the hazard. And so if you don't have issues with nuclear fuel, you don't have to have a plan to address it.
Right.
So it's about addressing what's there. And the other thing I've observed is it is impossible to eliminate psychosocial hazard. You can't.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't. Bullying obviously is something that can be prevented, but there are other things that occur in the workplace that, frankly, it might seem reasonable. I've spent some time in the fire rescue service. You can't eliminate the buildings on fire, and that's the job. So then, how do you help people be more resilient in that environment?
Yes.
And so I think that this is it's good for our country, in my view, to have organizations and groups like the coalition who can help these companies, either public, private, nonprofit, whatever they are, focus on what they want to be, something that's aspirational.
Yes.
Because to get there is going to require a lot of different things depending on where you are. But if I want to be a group that is certified, from a dignity perspective, it depends on who we are, it depends on who's in the room, but this could be really good. It could be really good. Yeah,
Yes.
Be really good.
Yeah. And we definitely hope to incorporate your instrument into that as well, because
Absolutely.
that's a great fit.
Yeah.
And and there is, for many organizations, there are things that they're doing that there's just not the awareness. And if you
That's
can
right.
get the awareness,
Right.
oftentimes they will address that. And even if it is for the second and third reasons that you listed, even if it is just for the financials or to avoid the punishment, it's okay, as long as they follow through, right?
Yeah. And we're getting close to wrapping it up, but I got to tell you that, something that some folks have recognized again here in the pandemic, turnover costs money.
Yes.
It does. Turnover costs money. And, I don't believe that there is a labor shortage. I believe that there is a shortage in the number of people who will be exposed to what you want to expose them to.
Yes.
That's because if they don't have the skills, train them.
Yep.
How about that? They don't have the, well, help them. How about, there are 8 billion people on the planet. There is somebody on this planet who would help you if you create a safe environment for them to do it, whether they have no education at all or a PhD. It's up to you to create an environment that is safe for people so they can fit in. Yeah, everybody's not going to be an engineer. Everybody's not going to be a professor. Everybody's not going to have an undergraduate degree, but can they bring value? Of course they can.
Yes, exactly.
Of course they can. Yeah,
exactly. And, and so many people, we lose sight of so much of the initial research on human behavior and organizations that is still so valid today. And what we know from McGregor's work is that work is an inherent part of life, and people want to work, they want to achieve. And when they're not doing so, there's a barrier that's in their way. And it's usually an employer doing the wrong thing that's the barrier. So let's get rid of the barrier. Let's let people produce, and let's let people produce that value that they all have. Every human being has.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So if folks want to learn more about the coalition, get a hold of you and the leadership of the coalition, how do they do that?
Yeah, so the best way is to go to our website, workplacebullyingcoalition.org. They can also, if they're reaching out to you, you can put them in touch with me. I tend to use my personal email for coalition business as well, so they should always feel free to reach out through that personal email. Or if they email the coalition through our website, then I will reach out to them probably with my personal email after that, so that we can have those types of exchanges. But visit our website, workplacebullyingcoalition.org. We have some links on there that people can find out about us. We're in an update phase, which we're hoping 2023 to roll out a whole new web page. So you can still contact us until then, but by January, we hope it'll be even more user friendly, and one click and you'll be in touch with either directly with me or with all the other volunteers that we have in our organization, and also be in touch with them based upon where your interest is. If it's engaging in research or educating other folks or working on legislation or working on that certification of different organizations, or just looking for someone to talk to or to share your story with, because it's another big piece that the targets need, that people who will listen to them. And we're trying to work on that this year too. So
absolutely. Well, Dr. Carbo, it's just such a pleasure to be able to spend some time chatting with you. The coalition is on my list of organizations to get more involved in, to be quite honest, and to be more connected to, because I see the work that we're doing as really being connected. This issue of psychosocial hazards has a lot of different ways to address it. And I come at it from a safety perspective, but the hazard itself there's a dignity approach. There is a legal issue associated with it. There is some labor. So there are a lot of different ways, because ultimately we do want people to have dignity at work. I think we want people to feel good at work and not feel it's a drudgery, and not feel it's not get a pit in their stomach when they think about it. And wouldn't it be wonderful? Or shall we be positive and say, won't it be wonderful someday when that's the case, certainly across this country. So again, thanks so much for the work that you've done so far and the work that you continue to do. Certainly happy to have you on this episode of the podcast. And for those who join us each week, thanks for being one of our, we've crossed over 1,000 or so supporters now. Wow. And if you get the opportunity, you're watching us on YouTube or you're listening and you get a chance to support what we're doing here, do the like and subscribe stuff, with YouTube. I'm not necessarily trying to become an influencer personally, but I do want to continue to spread the word about, psychosocial hazards and about psychological health and safety. And I too want to see someday, I do think we need legislation, but whether we have legislation or not, we're going to keep on pushing. Folks like you and I, we're going to continue to do what it takes so folks feel better at work. And so that's it. That's that's this episode. Again, thanks for joining me today. And for those of you who've joined us, we'll look forward to see you next time on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.